Hi friends, welcome to Diving Python series. In this video, we're going to talk about how to create API endpoints in Flask. So what's an API endpoint? An API endpoint is just a route at which our server listens for HTTP requests and sends responses like JSON, text or CSV. The difference between the API endpoint and the normal server is basically API endpoint gives you responses which are generally text or JSON or something like that, which are not meant for human consumption like displaying in the browser, but are actually used by other programs for other purposes. For example, I've got an API endpoint running at my local system, and the API endpoint is localhost 1500 slash sum slash 3 slash 6, and the result is giving you the sum of these two values. So if I just write sum of 3 comma 8, I'm going to get the values in the result. So this is a very simple API endpoint. So if you don't know how to use Flask for building web services in Python, I've made a playlist of videos for understanding Flask, and I will leave the link of this playlist in the description. So let's get started with coding and create a very simple API endpoint. So I'm going to take a blank folder and I'm going to open it with VS Code. I'm going to create a new file. I'll just name it server.py. So this is a very simple Flask server. I imported Flask class from the Flask module and created an instance of a Flask server, and I'm making this Flask server to run at localhost port 5000. So let's try to create a route which acts as an API endpoint. So I'm going to write app.route, and let's make the route to listen to the home URL itself. So app.route slash, and I'm going to create a function which will act as a route. So let me try to create a function called hello, and in the response, instead of returning a template, let's try to return data. So let's try to return an object which says a message called hello world. Alright, this server now returns a JSON object which says message hello world. So let's try to run this server, and let's try to open localhost 5000, and here in the message you got hello world. So imagine an API endpoint you create that can send you alerts of the system or status of the system or some status of some reports, etc. So API endpoints can be used for systems to talk between each other through messages, something like this JSON messages. Alright, wouldn't it be nice if you are able to give some inputs to these API endpoints and it does some calculation and gives you the result? So how can we pass inputs to this API endpoints? So generally there are three techniques to send data to API endpoints. One is through URL segments. For example, you can have a route called slash sum slash 1 slash 3. That means the API endpoint will pick up the inputs from these URL segments, or else you can pass inputs in the query string, something like slash sum question mark x equal to 1 and y equal to 3 and z equal to 4 and something like that. So you can give name parameters in the query string of the URL. So the server can pick the parameters from the query string, and you can send the payload in the request body also. Suppose you are doing some HTTP post request or update request or something like that, you can give inputs in the request body, and the server can take the inputs from the request body and process the inputs and give the result. One thing you have to note here is that you can't send request body in case of get request, but you can send request body in case of other requests like post, update, delete, etc. Alright, now let's see the example of how we can extract inputs from the URL segments. So here I am declaring the inputs in the app.route, and to mention the input variables, you have to enclose them between this greater than and less than symbols. So let's try to create this example. So let's try to modify our example. Instead of the home URL, let's try to create a URL at sum, and let's try to take two variables called x and y, and let's try to make the sum of it. So let's try to create a sum equal to x plus y, and these x and y can be obtained as a inputs to the function. So I can write x comma y. So if you declare variables in this app.route enclosed between this greater than and less than tags, these variables can be declared and used in our functions. So I got the sum derived here. So let's try to send this result in the API endpoint. So let's try to give a JSON where I'm giving the result as sum. So let's try to save this, and let's try to go to our API endpoint at slash sum slash 5 slash 6, and here you can see the result is 56, because by default the URL is actually a string and our server will pick the variables as string. So one thing you can do is you can convert it to integer, and I can write integer of x and I can write integer of y. Now the strings will be converted into integers, and you have to get the sum of 5 plus 6 as 11. So let's try to save this, and let's try to reload this, and you can see the result is 11. So instead of taking strings from the URL and converting them into our data types, we can even declare some data types in Flask, something like I can say integer of x and integer of y. So I'm declaring that the variables which are being scraped from the URL will be integers. So I don't need to mention them as integers now, because by default Flask will cache them into integers and supply them to the variables x and y. So let's try to save this now, and let's try to reload this, and still you get result as 11 because Flask has converted the inputs which are strings into integers. And one more thing is that you don't need to handle invalid URLs. So if I write 5 comma abcd, you will get URL not found but not error, because Flask will not qualify this route for this route which you have given, because this route will be valid only if you give an integer, but here I did not give an integer. So if I just write 4 here, then you'll get the result. So this way type declaration is really helpful in Flask. So alright, that was how you can extract inputs from URL segments. So what if you want to extract inputs from query parameters? So if I have a URL something like /sum question mark x equal to 2 and y equal to 5, and the variables x and y will be available to my route function. So let's try to do that now. So let's try to remove these URL segments, because we are going to take the inputs from the query parameters. So I won't get this x and y in my inputs. So how can I get x is through request, and this request should be imported from Flask request dot args dot get, and you can write the name of the variable in the query parameters, and the name was x. And let me duplicate this line and get the query parameter called y and give them to the variable called y. So I got x and y from query parameters, and let me try to add them and give the result as sum. So now let's go to this URL /sum question mark x equal to 2 and y equal to 5, and if I just enter, I'll get 25, because these two are extracted as strings, right? So let's try to declare the type. So let me write type equal to int, and here also type equal to int. So now Flask will try to extract the parameters from the URL and try to convert them as per your type. So let's try to reload this again, and you'll get result as 7, because we have converted the URLs from string into our desired type, which is integer. You can even convert them to float also. Let me try to write float here and save this, and write something like x equal to 2.8 and y equal to 5.4, and go, and you got the result 8.2, because these two are interpreted as float now. Since we have interpreted them as float, you should get your integers also covered. So you got result as 7 because it's interpreted as float. And there is one more handy option which you can give as a second parameter, which is a default value. So if you don't mention x, you can by default take it as 0 or some other value. So let me try to take x as 10 if I don't mention x. So this is the default value of the variable x, which has to be taken from the query parameters. So if I just write /sum question mark y equal to 5 and just ignore x, you can see the result is 15, because by default if x is not present in the query parameters, I'm taking it as 10. So this way this default value input is also useful if you want to address null values. So that's it guys, this is how you can extract inputs from query parameters. Alright, let's go to the next way of extracting data, which is from the request body. So I can't demonstrate a request body example using this browser, because when you send a request to a server using browser, it will be a HTTP GET request, but you can't send request body in case of a GET request. You can do other types of requests like post request, update request, delete request, etc. So to demonstrate that, I've got an extension installed in my VS Code called REST client, and using this extension you can do request in your VS Code and see the results. You can even use clients like Postman, but I prefer using REST client now. Alright, let's try to create an endpoint that can extract data from the request body. Since I am not going to take the request body from GET request, I have to mention the request type. So I'm going to write methods equal to post. So I'm telling that this endpoint listens for HTTP post request. So if you want to get the request body, you have to write request dot get JSON. So this will fetch the request as a JSON from your request body. So let me give it a variable called request, or else request JSON. So request JSON will contain the JSON object values from your request body. And suppose if I have a variable in my JSON called x, let's try to assign it to this variable called x in my Python code. So I'll just write request JSON of x. So I'm extracting x from the request JSON dictionary. And then let me try to extract y also. So y equal to request JSON of y. So this is just extracting dictionary key values. So I got x and y from my request JSON, which is actually obtained using request.getJSON. So since my method is a post request, I can get the JSON from my post body, and I'm computing the sum and returning the result. So let me try to save this, and now I have to create a post request, right? I can't do that from a browser. So let me try to create a new file. I'll just write it request.http, and let's try to create a request and run this with REST client. So it's really simple. You just create a file with an extension .http in VS Code and install REST client extension, and now I can write the URL http localhost 5000, and the endpoint is at /sum, and I need to say http /1.1 because it's the version of http which I'm going to use. And then I'm going to write content type as application JSON because I'm sending JSON as a request body, and then I'm going to give my request body after a one line space. So my request body is going to be something like x, it's not accepting single quotes, x3 and y5. So this is my request JSON, and now since I've installed REST client extension, I'm getting this button send request. So let me try to click this send request, and here we got 405 method not allowed because I'm not sending HTTP post, right? So I'm going to write post and then send request, and now you got okay, and the result is 8 because our server is listening for the post request, and from my JSON x and y are being extracted, and the sum is calculated and sent in the result. So what if you want to send some text in request body instead of JSON? You can just write content type as text instead of application. I can just write content as text plain and send some text something like hi, how are you? And in server, if I do this get JSON, now I'll get an error. So if I'll just run this request, you'll get an error, that internal server error, because I'm not able to parse it. So instead of using request.getJSON, if you want to get the raw message, you can write request.data and convert it to string. So it's actually a byte string, so you have to convert it to string like this. So string of request data, then you'll get the raw request data, and I'm sending it to a variable called text and sending it in the result. So if I just save it and send the request again, now you'll get result hi, how are you? And if I write something like hi and send the request, you'll get hi again. So this is how you can extract JSON from your post body request and parse it and do computations at your API endpoints. So the next thing we're going to talk about is choice of HTTP methods for API endpoints. So you can create multiple API endpoints like this in your application, right? But what methods will your API endpoints use? For example, I'm using a post method here, and in my previous example, I was using HTTP get method. So what method should be used for our API endpoints? So generally, as per the REST convention, which is representational state transfer, generally the HTTP verb of your API endpoint should be as per the action it is doing. Suppose your API endpoint is querying for data, you can use a GET request. And if your API endpoint is creating or giving some commands, you have to use the POST request. Or if your API endpoint is trying to modify something, you can make it listen at HTTP put request. Or if your API endpoint is trying to delete something, you can make it listen at the HTTP delete request. And now let's talk about the HTTP status codes which you can send in your responses. If everything is okay, by default Flask sends a HTTP status code called 200, because 200 in HTTP convention means okay. These are some of the important HTTP status codes. Suppose if I create an API endpoint which tries to divide two numbers. So if I have a endpoint like divide, and if I'm taking x and y values from that, I'm trying to divide two numbers and say this. So if I send something like y as 0 and send the request, okay, it was the divide endpoint. So if I just send request here, you'll get an error which is 500 internal server error. Since I got an error here, I got 500 internal server error. But if I want to send the user that a request is a bad request, I can use this 400 status code and tell him that the request is a bad request. So if I can just write if y equal to 0, I can send a message something like return error as y should not be 0, and I can give a status code called 400 because it was a bad input, right? So let's save it and again send the request, and now it's a bad request HTTP status code, and I'm giving the error also. So this way you can use HTTP status codes to convey the status of the request handling. So these are some of the most used HTTP status codes. So you can use these status codes to inform the listener about the status of the endpoint processing. So that's it guys. This is how you can create very simple API endpoints in Flask. You can see I've created a blog post on creating API endpoints in Flask. I've also given you the source code and examples so that you can copy paste and practice it on your own computer. I've also given references to the Flask documentation so that you can do the further reading. Please post your valuable feedback or ask any questions in the comment section. Hope you like this video guys. Thank you for watching.